I would like to start by asking you to tell us something about your education, your background. I know that you did your elementary education in Iran, right?
I did, yes. I went to up to third grade in Mir School in Tehran. But after that, I was sent off to England for a boarding school. Well, my father was very enamored with British education. He had studied at a boarding school in India. His parents hadn't been able to afford him to go into England. So when he could afford it, he sent his two sons to England boarding school. So he was a firm believer in British education, even if it was boarding school education. So from basically age 10 until university, I was in boarding schools in England. A school that originally, I think, had been a missionary school, but during the Reza Shah period, it was nationalized. But there were a lot of kids there who were from Muslim backgrounds, Armenian backgrounds. It was a very mixed school. And I was actually reading some memoirs recently of some of the dissidents in the under the Shah. They had gone to Mir. I didn't remember them at that time. Tabrizi, the woman who was in prison for a long time and recently died in Paris. In her memoirs, she mentions she went to Mir. I don't remember her. I may have not been in the same class. But I remember actually in this school that there were boys and girls in the same class. Well, the prep school was actually in Buckingham. It was a small school. I was basically the only foreigner there. But then I went to another boarding school, Rugby, which is basically a middle school before university. And there, it was mostly a sports school, basically. People were interested. It was a jock school. But I did have a very good teacher in history. And I wish I knew more about him, but it's always intrigued me that in senior school class, this would they call sixth form in England, he introduced me to Christopher Hill, which was very surprising because this was a very conservative public school, which is in England means a private school. But he, for some reason, was very interested in Christopher Hill. This was in the late 1950s, 58, 59. So I would love to know if I meet him in the next life. I would like to ask him what.
Do you remember his name?
Yes, I remember his name. Hope Simpson was his name. And he must have been a very sort of unique character in that school, teaching people Christopher Hill, because Christopher Hill was well known at that time as a Marxist historian. And for him to actually do using that in class in the late 50s was quite unique.
And that is where you think your inspiration to pursue history as an academic field or just something that you're interested in came from this teacher.
Right, he was teaching, yeah, it was his introduction. Then it was more than that. After sixth form, I needed some sort of cramming, which is preparation to get into Oxbridge. He sent me to a tutor in London to prepare me for the exams. And this tutor, again, I wish I knew more about him. He said, oh, you must apply to St. John's College because there's a young Don there who's very good. His name is Keith Thomas. And of course, at that time, no one had ever heard of Keith Thomas. Later, he became Sir Keith Thomas and is, very prominent in the field of history. But he basically guided me to apply to St. John's to study with Keith Thomas. Again, I wish I knew what his connection was.
So when we talk about history or your interest in history in this stage of your life, what are we talking about? Is it British history? Is it world history? I imagine it's mostly British history, right?
Yeah, the curriculum in those days in England, and it was very insular. You basically did English history from Anglo-Saxons to World War I. So you basically did a national history over the centuries, very little time outside English history. So my specialty often, because of Christopher Philip, was I was very interested in the English Revolution, was at that time known as the Puritan Revolution or the Cromwellian Revolution. So I usually did extra papers on that period. So that was my main focus, was that. And when I finished and got it into Oxford, again, the curriculum was very much insular. That you couldn't really do exam papers outside Europe. With one paper you could do actually with American colonial history, which I wasn't interested. I again specialized in the English Revolution. But when I graduated in 1963, I realized that basically I was very much interested in Iran. I was going back and forth to Iran during the summer holidays. I realized that I could basically study Iranian history rather than British history. And at that time, actually in Britain, there wasn't much Iranian history that you could study. I talked to Hourani, Professor Hourani, who was head of the St. Antony's College. He basically politely said, if you come to St. Antony's, you would have to study with Sir Rida Bullard, the former ambassador, or Anne Lambton. And he realized I would really not be suitable for them to study with. So he encouraged me to go to Columbia. He said I would get a better education in Middle East, in Middle East Center at Columbia rather than in England. And interesting, at that time also in the States, the problem was with history, it was very much controlled by Orientalists. I was not interested in Orientalism. I already had a gut reaction to what I'd read from the Orientalist works. I wanted to do the type of history I knew in Britain to Iran, and that wouldn't have sat well with Orientalists. So actually I applied to the political science department because there I knew I could do contemporary Iran or modern Iran, not have to be bogged down in medieval or in literature. I wasn't interested in Hafez or Saadi or Omar Khayyam. I was very interested in political history of the 20th century. So I ended up in the Middle East Center in Columbia, which at that time was very well funded, thanks to the Cold War. So we had a lot of actually well-known professors in Middle East history. But again, there was actually sort of limitations on Iran because the people we had for Iran, who were very reputable historians, felt too nervous to talk anything beyond 1906. So any course you took on Iranian history, the guillotine came 1906, the professors were not willing to say anything beyond that because it was too sensitive politically. So there was very little modern history. You had to do that on your own.
Let me go a little back and see if you can give a sense of intellectual academic environment, debate and discussions at Oxford or UK before you came to this country. What were the debates? Because we are now into the 60s, right?
No, I mean, I think the height of historiography and history debates was actually at that period in England, mainly because there were two big debates that went on and off, and some of the literature reading is still actually worth reading because it's very well written and it's very hard-hitting. Sometimes American academics get sort of shocked by the anger on both sides, but it was a very lively debate. And one major debate was, of course, what was called the storm over the gentry, which was in the past and present, whether basically the English Revolution was caused by the rise of the gentry, which was the conventional view, and then the counter argument that was brought that it was actually caused by the decline of the gentry. So the material was there, and there was a very, I would say, back and forth, especially in the pages of past and present, over this discussion. And here you had actually a historiographical debate about it. Of course, there was politics involved in it, but it was an intellectual debate about sources, how to use the sources, what it meant. And of course, there was a bigger question about the rise of capitalism, what generated capitalist societies in Western Europe. So this was the debates I was familiar with. When I came to political science departments, it's true it was more contemporary, but the main interest there with the political scientists was what is in the interest of the United States in the Middle East. So the courses were basically, what are U.S. interests? What are the U.S. interests best preserved? How do you preserve them? This was the underlying agenda of much of the contemporary courses. So the main advisor I had was mainly concerned about U.S. presence in the Middle East. I was not interested in that. I had more interested in looking at Iran or the Middle East in a sort of past and present perspective rather than in a question of U.S. interest.
I just have a question. This is when Charles Isawi was at Columbia, right? And J.C. Horwitz was at Columbia working on the Middle East, right?
Yeah. Charles Isawi also sort of flattered himself that he had one time dabbled with Marxism, but of course he had grown out of that. And J.C. Horwitz always started his lectures about he had no stake in the discussions. He was not pro-Israel or pro-Arab, but of course everyone knew he was very much a supporter of Israel. There's nothing wrong with that, but he basically claimed that he was a purely objective perception of what was going on in the Middle East. So he was my main advisor, but I don't think any of my work was in any way influenced by him. I just had to have someone to have my advisor. When I finished my dissertation, I asked him for a letter of recommendation. He said he would be willing to give me a letter of recommendation if I was applying for the Department of Sanitation in New York. If it had been for environmental support, I would have taken him up, but he clearly did not like my work. You have to put it in context. The week I applied, I asked him for the letter. It was the student uprising in Columbia, and the faculty were outraged that for a couple of days they couldn't go into their offices because students were barricading him. And somehow he associated me with student rebellion, although there was no way I could have been participating in that. I would have been promptly deported. So in his mind, I was sort of part of the enemy because the students were the enemy. And the Middle East Center, in fact, was the most right-wing group at Columbia at that time. They voted first to call in the police to beat up the students. They were more right-wing than any other center or department at Columbia at that time.
So in my research on Ahmad Ashraf, I came across with some documents that speaks about a group of Iranians during this period. I remember your name, Ahmad Ashraf, that you all were PhD candidate, graduate students in New York and had some gatherings. Do you remember anything? Or am I right on this? Or Were there either intellectual, political discussions among this generation of now very senior scholars of Iran outside of Colombia?
Yes, there was actually in New York a very lively Khaneh Iran that used to meet once a week, and was very actually interesting and lively because it included all sorts of perspectives, of political perspectives. I mean, there were National Front people like Shahin Fatemi. There were the Islamic groups like Naqshab. There was also what we call leftists, but usually Marxists, either the Roi Servom or pro-Tudeh groups, individuals basically. There were leftists. Later it became much more on the far left, having Siruz Yagane, my good old friend, was very much active. There was also Tabari, who was related to famous Tabari, but he was not so political, but he was very much involved. So it was actually a lot of, I mean, many of the people from Colombia doing their PhDs also would participate in Khaneh Iran. So I can't remember in Colombia whether there was really a group. Maybe people we met as for lunch or something, but there was no organized group there. It was much more the group activity was in Khaneh Iran. I mean, Ashraf was obviously there.